Listen closely. The Bible tells you only what it must, but the ancient world preserved what it could not fit on a single page. Tonight, we open the vault. We will name the daughters of Adam and Eve as remembered across Jewish Midrash, Second Temple era writings, Syriac and Arabic Christian lore, and Gnostic texts, sources that sat just outside the final canon. We'll trace where the names came from, why they were pushed to the margins, and what these women meant to the first storytellers of humanity. When you open the book of Genesis, it begins simply. The breath of God, the dust of the earth, a garden, and the first two human beings. It's a tale every child is told, the beginning of everything. The text moves with purpose, naming Cain, Abel, and Seth, as if the entire destiny of humankind could rest on just 3 names. But hidden in the briefest of lines, the Bible hints at something greater. And Adam had other sons and daughters. No names, no stories, just silence. That silence, however, didn't last. In the centuries that followed, storytellers, scholars, and seekers began to fill the space between those lines. They spoke of daughters born before the exile from Eden, of sisters who walked beside the first brothers, of women who carried life into a barren and broken world. Some were described as radiant, symbols of new beginnings, others as tragic, marked by the shadow of their parents' fall. Their names passed through generations in whispers, spoken in temples, carried by wandering tribes, recorded in languages long lost. These forgotten daughters were more than background figures. They became answers to ancient questions. How did the human race continue? Who did Cain marry? What happened to the family after Eden's gates closed? Each tradition offered its own vision, some tender, some unsettling. Some imagined that the daughters were twin-born with their brothers, destined to pair and preserve humanity. Others claimed they were mothers of nations, the first to teach, to labor, to build, to mourn. Yet as time passed, these stories were set aside, the canon was sealed, and what did not fit within its narrow frame was deemed unnecessary, sometimes even dangerous. The daughters faded into apocrypha, half remembered, half feared, figures who existed in the tension between revelation and imagination. But in the hidden texts that survived, they still live, named, described, and given purpose by those who refuse to let their memory vanish. And tonight, their names will be spoken again. We will trace their origins, not to challenge Scripture, but to understand the minds of those who stood at the dawn of faith and tried to complete the story. We will see how each retelling shaped the moral world of early humanity, the idea of family, the burden of sin, the nature of love after the fall. Listen well, for these are not tales of myth alone, they are fragments of our oldest memory. The daughters of Adam and Eve stand as a reminder that even in silence, the human story continues to speak. The canonical text does not list the daughters' names, but it does admit they existed. In Genesis, after the birth of Seth, a single sentence appears almost in passing, and Adam had other sons and daughters. That one line, tucked between generations, carries a vast silence. No numbers, no names, no tales, just an acknowledgement that humanity did not begin and end with 3 sons. That brevity is deliberate. In the world of ancient genealogies, every word served a purpose. Names were preserved to establish descent, inheritance, or priestly authority. And in that culture, the record traced its thread through men, the founders of clans, the keepers of land, the bearers of covenant. The women, though present and vital, remained unnamed in the written lineage, existing in the breath between verses. The silence is not a void, but a choice. The ancient writers built their narrative like a sacred architecture, shaped to lead the reader toward one clear purpose, the descent of Israel through Seth. The text therefore narrows its focus, pruning everything that might distract from that line. It is not a denial of the daughters, but a compression of history, human experience reduced to what the covenant story needed to tell. And yet, even in that restraint, the story reveals more than it conceals. The very mention of sons and daughters hints at a family far larger than the written record allows. The first household was not 2 parents and 3 sons. It was a multitude, a living community bound by the same soil from which they were formed. Ancient interpreters understood this. They recognized that the text's silence did not mean absence. It invited imagination. To them, the daughters were there from the beginning, bearing children, building homes, weaving the human thread that would stretch across generations. Without them, the story of humanity could not continue. The omission, then, is not a mystery for its own sake. It is the writer's economy, a way of saying this happened, while leaving the details to the listener's inheritance of oral memory. It was never meant to erase the daughters, but to keep the focus on the covenant's unfolding path. Still, that restraint sparked centuries of wondering. Who were these unnamed women? What were their lives, their names, their legacies? Later generations would not accept silence as an answer. They would remember and rename the daughters of Adam and Eve. Centuries before the New Testament, a Jewish work emerged that dared to fill in the blanks Genesis left open. It was called the Book of Jubilees, a retelling of the early chapters of creation with the precision of a scribe and the imagination of a poet. In its fourth chapter, the story unfolds not in fragments, but in careful sequence. Eve gives birth to Cain and Abel, and to a daughter named Awan. Later, when Seth is born, he takes as his wife Azura, described explicitly as his sister. These are the earliest surviving Jewish names given to the daughters of Adam and Eve. They stand as quiet witnesses to an older current of tradition, one that flowed alongside the canonical text but was never fully absorbed into it. To some ancient communities, Jubilees was sacred history, read aloud, copied, and cherished as scripture. To others, it was revered but kept apart, an honored companion to Genesis that spoke where Genesis was silent. That tension, respected but not universal, explains why these names lingered at the edge of sacred memory. Not forbidden, but whispered. Awan and Azura were not inventions born of idle fancy. They were solutions, answers to the questions that troubled early interpreters. If Adam and Eve had only sons, how did the world grow? Whom did Cain and Seth marry? The author of Jubilees offered the straightforward answer that the ancient mind found reasonable. Their sisters. Humanity, after all, was still one household. The moral laws that would later define kinship had not yet been spoken from Sinai. The earth was young. Life itself was sacred enough to transcend taboo. Through these names, the Jubilees author does more than fill narrative gaps. He restores the symmetry of beginnings. 2 brothers, 2 sisters. 4 children bound in a cycle of birth, loss, and renewal. Cain's union with Awan produces a line marked by restlessness and craft. Seth's union with Azura continues the chosen line that will lead to Noah, Abraham, and beyond. In this framework, the daughters are not ornaments to the story, they are its continuation. And yet, even as these names were spoken, they began to slip toward the margins. When later editors shaped the Hebrew canon, Jubilees was left outside. Its details survived in the scrolls of Qumran, in the chants of priests, and in the memory of those who saw the divine, not only in the patriarchs, but in the mothers and sisters who sustained them. For those who kept the book, these women were real, essential links in the chain of creation. For those who did not, they remained shadows, hints, echoes of what might have been preserved had the story been told in full. And so, through the names Awan and Azura, the ancient imagination gave faces to the silence. The daughters once hidden between verses now stepped into light, completing the family portrait of humanity's first home. Rabbinic teachers, inheriting both scripture and silence, expanded the early hints into vivid detail. They were not content to let the family of the first humans remain a skeletal genealogy. Their task was to make the story breathe, to fill the quiet spaces between the verses. In one early commentary, a saying appears that reshapes the familiar story: 2 went up to the bed and 7 came down. The image is startling and intimate. It means that when Eve bore Cain, she also bore his twin sister, and when she bore Abel, she bore 2 twin sisters. The family, then, was larger than most readers imagine, a web of siblings born in pairs, bound by both blood and destiny. From this, a tension arises. The Midrash suggests that the quarrel which ended in Abel's death may have been more than jealousy over a rejected offering. It may have been about love, rivalry, and the right to marry the extra sister. The story of Cain and Abel, then, is not only about worship, but about human passion, about how the first desires and loyalties took root in the soil of Eden's aftermath. Other streams of rabbinic thought, such as those collected in later teachings, preserve similar traditions, that each son was born with his mate beside him, destined to ensure the world's survival. In these readings, the daughters are not mere background, they are necessary participants in creation's unfolding. Without them, the command to be fruitful and multiply could not continue beyond the garden's gates. But what matters here is not the rivalry or the romance, it is the interpretive instinct. The sages took seriously the single verse that said Adam had sons and daughters. They refused to treat it as a throwaway line. To them, every word of Scripture was a seed, and even its silences were fertile. So they constructed a family structure that made sense of the world's beginnings, a structure in which humanity grew from one pair, multiplied by divine intention, not by contradiction. These midrashic echoes remind us that ancient interpreters were not inventing wild legends. They were doing what faithful readers have always done, listening closely to what the text says and equally to what it does not say. Their stories of twins, of rivalry, of sisters unnamed, were ways of defending the coherence of Genesis. Proof that even what was omitted still had meaning. And so through these rabbinic windows, the first family becomes less abstract, more human. We see not distant symbols, but brothers and sisters, bound by love, faith, and conflict, the full range of what it means to be human, written into the very first household. Move east, and the names shift with language. The story changes voice, but not its heartbeat. In the Syriac world, the Cave of Treasures, a chronicle woven between history and theology, preserves its own account of Adam's household. There, Cain is born with a twin sister named Labuda, and Abel with Kelîmath, sometimes rendered Kelîmath or Kelîma. These names are not symbolic, they are part of the genealogy. Each sister is joined to her brother's generation, binding the story of love, rivalry, and lineage into a single thread. The Cave of Treasures envisions Adam's family as the seedbed of nations, the first human community from which all others descend. It does not dwell on moral scandal or mythic mystery. Rather, it sees these daughters as the means by which the divine command, "Be fruitful and multiply," was fulfilled. The text insists that every birth, male or female, carried divine purpose, echoing through the centuries of human history that followed. As the story moved into Arabic and later Christian Islamic traditions, the names evolved again. In these retellings, Cain's sister becomes Iqlima and Abel's Labuda. Their stories survive not in scripture, but in teaching tales, genealogical chronicles, and illustrated histories meant to explain how humanity continued after the expulsion from Eden. These were stories told in homes, in schools, in places of worship, passed on not as dogma, but as memory. These accounts were never part of the Quran, nor of the canonical Bible. Yet they lived on in the imagination of believers who sought to complete the portrait of the first family. They served a purpose shared across centuries. To answer the question every reader of Genesis eventually asks, who were the wives of the first sons? Across languages, Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, the pattern remains constant. The daughters exist. They are given names. They are paired with their brothers, not as afterthoughts, but as anchors of descent. They are the threads that bind divine creation to human continuity. Each tradition, in its own tongue, restores what the canonical text compresses. Together, they form a chorus of remembrance, voices that refuse to let the first women vanish from humanity's beginning. And though the spellings differ, Awan, Azura, Kelîmath, Lebhûdhâ, Iqlima, Labuda, the message does not. Every culture that inherited Adam's story found its own way to restore the missing names. It is as though the human spirit could not bear to leave the mothers of the world unnamed. Another ancient voice from the Second Temple world adds its testimony, a text often known as Biblical Antiquities, attributed to an anonymous writer later called Pseudo-Philo. It retells the primeval history of Genesis with a bold specificity, expanding where the canonical text is sparse and naming what the sacred record left unnamed. Within its retelling, Adam and Eve are said to have 12 sons and 8 daughters. The account does not speak in vague generalities. It lists names, giving substance to those who, in Genesis, exist only as a whisper. Among them appear Fua, Iectas, Arabica, Sifa, Teshia, Saba, and Asen, Though the manuscripts differ, the memory is clear. The family of the first humans was vast, organized, and fully populated with both sons and daughters. This enumeration is significant. It demonstrates that by the 1st century of the Common Era, Jewish thinkers were already constructing complete genealogies that went beyond the few figures preserved in the canonical narrative. They were not inventing new stories to replace Scripture, but rather extending the logic of its brief statement that Adam had other sons and daughters. The expansion is an act of precision, not rebellion. It transforms a single line of text into a portrait of a thriving household, a patriarchal and matriarchal community that mirrors the fullness of human life, as ancient people knew it. In this account, the daughters are not shadowy or incidental. They stand as recorded members of the first generation, each with a name and place in the pattern of descent. To list them is to acknowledge their existence as part of divine providence. The names themselves, varied across copies and languages, testify to the circulation of these traditions throughout the Jewish world, from Palestine to the Hellenistic diaspora. Scribes and storytellers preserved what they could, adjusting spellings and details, but always returning to the same conviction. Adam and Eve's family was larger and more intricate than the canonical record suggests. The inclusion of 8 daughters also carries symbolic weight. In ancient thought, numbers were never arbitrary. 12 sons evoke completeness and tribal fullness, while 8 daughters suggest abundance beyond necessity, an overflowing of life and blessing. The writer may have sought to mirror the structure of later Israel, whose tribes numbered 12, showing that even the beginnings of humanity were patterned after divine order. Pseudo-Philo's account therefore stands as one of the earliest surviving attempts to quantify the entire first generation. It bridges mythic origin and historical imagination, turning sparse narrative into structured genealogy. Through it, we glimpse how Second Temple readers approach the text with reverence, but also with freedom to elaborate where the sacred word invited further understanding. In that elaboration, the daughters finally emerge from anonymity. They become more than an afterthought in a patriarchal record. They are given names, counted among the founders of the world, and acknowledged as essential to the unfolding of human history. What began as a single sentence in Genesis expands here into a living lineage, one that refuses to let half of humanity remain unspoken. In the centuries after the Second Temple era, a different stream of thought arose, one that looked at the creation story through the lens of rebellion, revelation, and hidden knowledge. Among the writings discovered at Nag Hammadi, dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a striking figure emerges from the shadows of Eve's family, Noria. In these texts, especially the hypostasis of the archons, she is named as the daughter of Eve and the sister of Seth. Her presence shifts the tone of humanity's beginnings from genealogy to cosmic struggle. In the Gnostic imagination, Noria is not a silent daughter or a passive inheritor of Eden's curse. She is a figure of awareness, one who perceives the corruption of the rulers who claim to govern the world. When these powers, called the archons, attempt to dominate humanity, Noria resists. She confronts them directly, unafraid of their authority. In one of the most vivid scenes, she even blows upon Noah's Ark, setting it aflame, a symbolic act of defiance against the imperfect systems of salvation devised by false powers. The Ark in this reading represents a world order built by those who do not understand the true divine light. Noria's destruction of it is not chaos, it is purification. Her defiance does not end there. When she is threatened and cast aside, a luminous messenger appears to her, revealing the deeper origin of her spirit. She learns that she descends not from the archons, but from the incorruptible realm, a place untouched by material tyranny. In this revelation, Noria becomes not only Eve's daughter, but also a voice of resistance, a bearer of divine knowledge, and in some Gnostic schools, a feminine counterpart to the Redeemer figure. She embodies insight that cannot be subdued, the spiritual spark that refuses to bow to flawed creation. Whatever one thinks of the theology that produced her, Noria's presence proves a universal impulse among ancient interpreters, the desire to restore what had been left unspoken. Where the canonical record was silent about daughters, these communities gave them power, voice, and consciousness. In her, the forgotten women of Genesis reappear, not as echoes of their brothers, but as independent souls with moral and cosmic significance. Through Noria, the myth of beginnings takes on a new dimension. She represents the conscience of humanity, questioning authority, discerning truth, and refusing to accept a world ruled by deception. Her defiance is not merely against earthly oppressors, but against the blindness of those who mistake domination for order. Thus, in the Gnostic texts, the line of Adam and Eve expands once again, not by bloodline, but by spirit. Noria becomes a symbol of what the earliest readers sensed instinctively, that creation's story is incomplete without the daughters' voices. In her defiance, she carries the torch of Eve's questioning, transforming silence into revelation and absence into power. Why aren't names like Awan, Azura, Kelîmath, Labuda, Iqlima, Labuda, or Noria printed in the Bible most people hold today? The answer lies not in suppression, but in the complex way sacred boundaries were drawn, genres were defined, and ancient storytelling operated. The first reason is canon boundaries. The books that preserve these names, works such as Jubilees, the Cave of Treasures, and the Gnostic writings from Nag Hammadi, were well known in the ancient world. They were copied, read, and cherished in many communities, yet they never entered the mainstream Jewish or Christian canon. Each faith tradition eventually fixed its list of authoritative books, favoring those most aligned with its theology and public worship. Texts that elaborated too freely or reflected speculative cosmology remained outside. But what was left beyond the boundary was not forgotten. These writings preserved details that the canon, in its economy of purpose, did not emphasize: family names, private scenes, and the hidden dimensions of humanity's first story. The second reason is genre and focus. The Book of Genesis is not a family registry. It is a theological architecture. Its aim is to trace how the world that began with Adam leads, through Seth, to Noah, to Abraham, and finally to Israel. Every name serves that line. The purpose is covenant, not census. Once the continuity of that chosen descent is secured, other names, especially those without legal or covenantal role, fall into the background. In the primeval world, the existence of niece or sister wives would have been assumed by ancient readers as the only means for humanity to multiply. The writer did not need to explain what the audience already understood. The narrative moves on because its focus lies elsewhere. The third reason lies in cultural convention. In the ancient Near East, genealogies were legal instruments as much as historical records. They established rights, land, and priestly order. Daughters were named only when their lives intersected law or theology, when inheritance or covenant depended on them. This was not an erasure born of contempt, but the product of a world where lineage was documented through the male line. Even early interpreters recognized this convention. Some, like Josephus, simply remarked, "They also had daughters," as if to affirm what was self-evident but unnecessary to detail. Taken together, these reasons explain why the daughters of Adam and Eve appear in the margins rather than the main column of Scripture. The canon chose compression over elaboration, lineage over anecdote. But the instinct to fill the silence never disappeared. Across centuries and languages, readers, teachers, and visionaries kept naming the unnamed, convinced that the story of beginnings could not be whole without them. Outside the Bible's table of contents, those names continue to live, not as rivals to Scripture, but as its reflection in fuller light. They represent the imagination of generations who believe that divine history must include every voice born at the dawn of the world. At this point, the fragments gathered across centuries can finally be placed side by side. Each tradition speaks its own language, yet together they form a continuous map of memory, a lineage reconstructed from echoes. Here, then, is the roster of names and threads, aligned across the ancient world. Awan, introduced in the Book of Jubilees as a daughter of Adam and Eve, she is presented as the wife of Cain. Her story restores balance to the primeval family and resolves the question of how Cain's line continued beyond Eden. Azura, named as Seth's sister and wife in Jubilees, she sustains the sacred lineage that the text traces from Adam to Noah. In later variations, her role shifts, but her presence remains constant, a figure of renewal and continuity after the first death. Unnamed twin sisters. The Midrashic commentaries, especially Genesis Rabbah, describe Cain as born with one twin sister and Abel with two. Their births explain both the population of the early world and the tragic rivalry that ends in fratricide. The 2 went up, 7 came down formula captures the belief that the first family multiplied rapidly, even if Scripture itself keeps their names unspoken. Kelîmath, Kelîma, and Labuda. In the Syriac Cave of Treasures, these are the paired sisters of Abel and Cain. Kelîmath is born with Abel, Lebhûdhâ with Cain. The narrative emphasizes their place in human descent, making the family whole once more within a sacred chronicle that stretches from Eden to the flood. Iqlima and Labuda. In later Arabic and Islamicate retellings, these names replace their Syriac counterparts. Iqlima is joined to Cain, Labuda to Abel. Their stories appear in historical and devotional literature that sought to harmonize the world's beginnings with familiar moral lessons. Norea. The Gnostic writings portray her as the daughter of Eve and the sister of Seth. In the hypostasis of the archons and later in the thought of Noria, she becomes a luminous rebel, a symbol of divine knowledge and spiritual defiance. Where other traditions recall mothers of nations, Noria embodies the soul's resistance to corruption. A long list and account. The work known as Biblical Antiquities attributes to Adam 12 sons and 8 daughters, naming several: Fua, Iqtas, Arabica, Sifa, Teshia, Saba, Asen, and others depending on the manuscript. It is the most extensive enumeration preserved from antiquity, transforming the silent phrase, sons and daughters, into a living census of early humanity. Josephus's witness, the Jewish historian, confirms that Adam and Eve had daughters, even if he declines to name them. His acknowledgement shows how deeply that understanding ran within ancient thought. The existence of the daughters was taken for granted, even when the record left them nameless. From these strands, the first human family emerges not as a sparse list of names, but as a complete network of kinship. Across languages and centuries, storytellers refused to let half of creation fade into silence. Each culture, each scribe, each teacher restored another missing thread, until the daughters of Adam and Eve stood once more beside their brothers, present in memory, if not in the printed canon. These women are not side notes or curiosities buried in forgotten texts. They are the living symbols of how ancient interpreters wrestled with the boundaries of Scripture, morality, and the human condition. Each name, Awan, Azura, Kelîmath, Labuda, Iqlima, Labuda, Norea, marks a distinct attempt to fill the silence of Genesis with meaning. Their stories are not accidental. They carry deliberate theological and cultural weight, touching the core themes that shaped humanity's earliest self-understanding. Legitimacy of early marriage. The first and most practical concern these traditions address is the origin of human society itself. By naming sisters as wives, ancient writers resolved a logical question that Genesis leaves hanging. How could the human race have multiplied from one pair alone? The answer was neither shocking nor controversial in antiquity. Early interpreters viewed sibling unions as a primeval necessity, not a violation. The laws against such unions had not yet been spoken. The earth was new, unpeopled, and divine intention had not yet imposed boundaries. In this framework, the pairing of brothers and sisters affirms the unity of humanity's origin rather than its division. Moral lenses on violence. The Midrashic teachers used these sisters to illuminate the moral dimensions of the world's first murder. The story of the extra sister, the one born alongside Abel, the one not assigned to a brother, becomes the spark of conflict between Cain and Abel. The tragedy of fratricide in this view is not only about offerings and divine favor, but also about human desire, jealousy, and possession. The woman's presence in the story is not incidental. She represents how relationships, longing, and injustice intertwine at the dawn of civilization. Through her, the first act of violence becomes a reflection on passion, ungoverned, and choice misused. Countervoices. Noria's emergence in the Gnostic corpus extends this dynamic in a new direction. In her story, a daughter of Eve becomes the conscience of humanity, the one who resists corruption, questions authority, and reaches for a pure divine reality beyond the flawed world of the archons. Whether one accepts the theology or not, her figure stands as an early example of protest literature within Jewish Christian tradition. Noria is not a rebel against faith but against false power. She transforms the silence of women in Genesis into a voice that challenges cosmic tyranny and demands truth. Memory across borders, from Hebrew texts to Syriac chronicles, from Jewish midrash to Arabic teaching stories, the same pattern repeats. The daughters exist, and their absence from Genesis is universally felt. Each culture responds by naming them anew, translating their identities into its own tongue and worldview. This shared impulse, to restore the missing half of humanity's beginning, reveals something profound about collective memory. It shows that the ancient mind, though divided by geography and creed, agreed on one essential truth. The story of origins is incomplete without the daughters of Adam and Eve. Together, these interpretations form more than folklore. They represent a centuries-long meditation on creation, morality, and divine justice. The hidden daughters embody humanity's effort to understand itself fully, to acknowledge not only the men who built the lineages of history, but the women whose existence made history possible. Their names survive as echoes of that insight, that the human story, from its first breath, was never told by one voice alone. Not in the sense of some hidden conspiracy or deliberate erasure. The absence of these names is not the mark of censorship, but of literary focus. Genesis was written with a narrow and sacred aim, to trace the unfolding of divine purpose through a chosen line, not to preserve every birth, name, or household. Its purpose was theology, not anthropology. The daughters of Adam and Eve fell outside that frame, not because they were denied existence, but because they were not needed for the lineage that led to Israel's story. Yet, as the narrative traveled across centuries, tongues, and empires, other communities refused to let that silence stand. They filled the void with their own names, their own explanations, their own imaginations. Jubilees called her Awan, the Syriac chronicles called her Kelîmath, the Arabic storytellers named her Iqlima or Aklima. Each name answers the same question that echoes through every generation: who did Cain marry? The variations are not contradictions, they are regional memories of the same impulse, to make the first family whole again. The truth that emerges is simple but profound. There was never one lost gospel of the daughters, never a hidden file suppressed by religious authority. What existed instead was the diversity of living tradition: Jewish, Christian, Syriac, Arabic, and Gnostic voices, each remembering the beginnings in their own idiom. Every culture that received Genesis felt the need to expand it, to humanize it, to complete it. So the so-called secret truth is this: the first family was never as small as the printed page suggests. Ancient tradition remembered Adam and Eve not as parents of 3 sons, but as founders of an entire community, crowded with daughters, each carrying a share of the world's new life. The canon may have left them unnamed, but the cultures around it refused to forget them. Their names, scattered across languages and centuries, are the footnotes to humanity's beginning, the reminder that even when history writes in one voice, memory writes in many. Picture the early world as the ancient interpreters imagined it, a landscape still echoing with the breath of creation, the soil fresh with the memory of Eden. Adam and Eve, exiled yet alive, build their household east of the garden. Time stretches wide before them. Their years are long, their children many. Sons and daughters are born, each carrying a fragment of the image once lost. In one tradition, Cain's sister and wife is Awan, the daughter who walks beside him as they build the first city. In another, she is called Labuda, her name preserved in the Syriac memory. Move eastward again, and in Arabic retellings she becomes Iqlima, a name spoken in teaching circles for generations. Abel's sister-wife is Kelîmath in Syriac tradition, Labuda in the Arabic. Her story ends with his death, a union broken by the first act of human violence. In these reconstructions, the world is still small, bound within one family. Marriage between siblings is not scandal, it is survival, the only way for life to continue. The scene unfolds in parallel streams of meaning. In Jubilees, the story is orderly, almost administrative. brothers and sisters paired to fulfill the command to multiply. In the Midrash, it becomes moral drama. An extra sister, unclaimed, becomes the point of jealousy that ignites the first murder. In Syriac and Arabic accounts, it becomes lineage and legend, the branching of nations from the first home. And in the Gnostic imagination, it becomes revelation. Noria, the daughter who will not bow, the one who sees beyond the corruption of mortal rulers. All these voices converge on the same truth, that the daughters are not background shadows, but structural pillars in the story's foundation. They bear the generations, embody the tensions, and in some retellings question the very order of the world. Imagine the scene as it might have been told in an ancient gathering. The elder recounts the births, Cain with his sister Awan, Abel with Kelîmath, Seth with Azura, and the listeners nod, for to them the family is full. They know what the text leaves unsaid. They know the world began not with 3 sons wandering alone, but with brothers and sisters bound in the fragile unity of early humanity. Even the historian Josephus, writing in his careful prose, affirms what everyone assumed: they also had daughters. He says no more, for there was no need. The knowledge was shared, ancient, obvious. The Bible whispers the fact in passing. The rest of antiquity, through its scrolls and commentaries, speaks the quiet part aloud. The daughters stand there: Awan, Azura, Kelîmath, Labuda, Iqlima, Labuda, Norea, each one a thread restoring the fullness of the first story. Through them, the beginnings of humanity come into focus, not as myth, not as silence, but as the crowded, complex living family from which the world began. When you open Genesis again and read the spare line, "And he had sons and daughters," don't let it pass as a footnote. Hear the chorus behind it. Awan and Azura in the Jewish imagination of the Second Temple age, Kelîmath and Labuda in the Syriac chronicles, Iqlima and Labuda in the Arabic tales, Noria blazing in the Gnostic visions of defiance and light. None of these names overturn the Bible. They do not challenge its authority or rewrite its message. They complete its silence. The silence Genesis chose for the sake of brevity and focus. They fill in the human texture that ancient writers assumed but never inscribed. Across centuries, languages, and faiths, these names survived in the margins, whispered by scribes, retold by storytellers, woven into homilies, and hidden in scrolls that refused to disappear. They are the echoes of humanity's oldest conversations about itself, about creation, family, desire, and the divine. These are the hidden daughters of Adam and Eve, not erased, but preserved off stage. They waited in the footnotes of time, in the memory of those who could not bear to let them fade. And now, when you return to that quiet verse, you will know what stands behind it. The line was brief. The story was vast. And now, you know where to find them. These are the hidden daughters of Adam and Eve, not erased, but preserved off stage. And now, you know where to find them.